The blue envelope arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a utility bill and a supermarket flyer. There was no return address, just my name and address written in an elegant hand I didn't recognize. Inside was a train ticket to Millfield, a small coastal town 3 hours north, and a brief note. "Rebecca, please come. There's something you need to know. Saturday, 2 p.m., the Lighthouse Café on Harbor Street. I'll be waiting. Vivian," my sister's name. Written in a stranger's handwriting. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, the ticket trembling in my fingers. Vivian had been dead for 35 years. She had drowned in the lake near our childhood home the summer I turned 16 and she was 18. A tragedy that had fractured our family beyond repair. My father retreated into silence, my mother into prescription medications. I had left for college 2 years later and rarely returned, building a life far from the shadows of our shared grief. Now, at 64, I had been retired from teaching for just over a year, widowed for 6, with an orderly life centered around my book club, my volunteer work at the library, and occasional visits from my son and his family. Nothing in this careful existence had prepared me for a message from a ghost. My first thought was that it must be a cruel prank, but who would do such a thing? Who even knew about Vivian besides my immediate family? I hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. My second thought was that perhaps I'd misread the signature. Maybe it wasn't Vivian, but some other name, Vivian or Virginia. Someone I'd met at a conference or charity event who expected me to remember them. But no, examining the note again, it was unmistakably Vivian. And the invitation, command, really, carried an urgency that unsettled me. I picked up the phone to call my son David, then set it down without dialing. What would I say? Someone claiming to be your long-dead aunt has invited me to meet them in a strange town? He would worry, perhaps even insist on accompanying me, or worse, suggest I was becoming confused in my advancing years. No, this was something I needed to address alone, at least initially. I would go to Millfield on Saturday. I would see who waited for me at the Lighthouse Café. And I would finally put to rest whatever lingering mystery surrounded my sister's memory. The train journey on Saturday morning gave me too much time to think, to remember. Vivian and I had been close as children despite our different temperaments. She was vibrant and fearless, charging into life with an intensity that both awed and alarmed me. I was the cautious one, the rule follower, the good girl. She teased me about it, but never cruelly. "Someone has to keep us respectable, Becca," she would say with that dazzling smile. The summer she died, something had changed between us. Vivian had become secretive, disappearing for hours without explanation. When questioned, she would smile mysteriously and say, "Just living my life, Becca. You should try it sometime." I had been hurt by her withdrawal, her sudden privacy. In the way of teenagers, I had responded with cold dignity, pretending I didn't care where she went or what she did. Then came that August afternoon when she didn't return from swimming. The search parties, the divers, the terrible moment when they found her body in the deepest part of the lake, far from the designated swimming area. The funeral where I stood numb between my shattered parents, unable to process that my vibrant sister was gone forever. The official ruling was accidental drowning. Vivian had been a strong swimmer, but perhaps she had developed a cramp or misjudged the distance back to shore. Or perhaps, as I sometimes wondered in the darkest hours of night, she had chosen to swim out too far, to end a troubled existence on her own terms. There had been no note, no explanation. Just absence and questions that would never be answered. As the train approached Millfield, I found myself smoothing my hair, checking my appearance in the reflection of the window. Foolish, I knew. I was meeting an imposter, not my sister. Yet some part of me couldn't help preparing as if for a real reunion. Millfield proved to be a picturesque town that had evolved from fishing village to tourist destination without losing its authentic charm. The Lighthouse Café was easy to find, a weathered blue building on the harbor with a stunning view of the bay and the historic lighthouse that gave it its name. At 5 minutes to 2, I pushed open the door, setting a small brass bell jingling. The café was half full, mainly with tourists enjoying late lunches. I scanned the room, looking for someone watching the door expectantly, someone who might have sent the mysterious invitation. "May I help you?" asked a young waitress. "I'm meeting someone," I said, still surveying the room. Rebecca Carson?" The waitress smiled. "Someone's waiting for you. This way, please." She led me to a corner table by the window where an elderly woman sat alone, gazing out at the harbor. Silver hair in an elegant bob, tailored navy pantsuit, slender hands adorned with a single silver ring. As we approached, she turned, and I felt a shock of recognition so profound I nearly stumbled. Her face was lined with age, but the eyes, Vivian's distinctive gray-blue eyes, the color of the lake at dawn, were unmistakable. She had our mother's high cheekbones, our father's determined chin. She looked, in fact, exactly as Vivian might have looked had she lived to her 70s. "You came," she said, her voice slightly husky with age, but achingly familiar in its cadence. "I wasn't sure you would." I stood frozen, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. "This isn't possible," I finally managed. "Vivian drowned. I attended her funeral. We buried her." "No, Rebecca," she said gently. "You buried an empty casket. Please, sit down. I have a lot to explain and very little time to do it." My legs felt suddenly unreliable. I sank into the chair opposite her, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. The waitress, sensing the tension, quietly retreated without taking an order. "You can't be Vivian," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She died 35 years ago." "I didn't die, Becca." She used the childhood nickname naturally, as if 3.5 decades hadn't passed since I'd heard it spoken in that voice. "I disappeared, by choice, and I've regretted not telling you every day since." "That's impossible," I insisted. "There was a body. They found you in the lake." She shook her head slightly. "They found a body wearing my clothes with my ID in the pocket." A girl approximately my age, my build, my coloring. A Jane Doe who was misidentified as Vivian Carson, giving me the clean break I thought I needed. "You're saying you faked your own death? Let our parents believe their daughter had drowned?" The magnitude of such deception was beyond comprehension. "Why would you do something so cruel?" Pain flashed across her weathered features. "I was 18, pregnant, and desperate. The baby's father was married, a fact I discovered too late. When I told him about the pregnancy, he threatened me, said he would ruin my reputation, destroy our family. I was young and frightened and saw no way out." She paused, her fingers tracing the condensation on her water glass. "That day at the lake, I met a girl. She was a runaway, living rough. We got talking, swimming together away from the public beach. When I shared my situation, she told me she was dying anyway, leukemia, untreated. She had maybe months left. I stared at her, unable to speak, as she continued her incredible story. It was her idea, not mine. She said she had no one who would miss her, no family searching for her. She suggested we swap clothes, identities. She would have a proper burial, a name on a stone. I would have freedom from my impossible situation. Vivian, if this truly was my sister, looked down at her hands. It sounds monstrous now, calculated, but we were just frightened girls, making a desperate choice. "So you let us believe you were dead," I said flatly. "For 35 years. You watched from somewhere as our family fell apart with grief. I didn't know how badly it would affect everyone," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I was going to send a letter, just to you after a year or so, to let you know I was alive, that I was okay. But then I saw Dad's obituary in the newspaper, a heart attack at 54. The article mentioned how he'd never recovered from his daughter's death. I realized then what I'd done, how selfish I'd been. I couldn't bring myself to reach out after that, to admit my part in his early death. And Mom? She spent the last 20 years of her life heavily medicated, barely present, because of her grief for you. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. I know. I've carried that guilt every day of my life, Rebecca. There's no excuse for what I did, no justification that makes it right. I was young and desperate and made a terrible choice that hurt everyone I loved. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. My sister, alive. Our family's defining tragedy, a deception. The weight of a lifetime of grief, unnecessary. The baby? I finally asked. What happened to your child? A complicated emotion crossed Vivian's face. Pride mingled with sorrow. Daniel, my son, he's 35 now, a doctor in Boston. He's the reason I'm contacting you now after all this time. She reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope, placing it carefully on the table between us. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I've been given 6 months, though I doubt I'll last that long. The clinical detachment with which she delivered this news stunned me almost as much as her initial revelation. I'm sorry, I said automatically, the words inadequate for the complexity of my feelings. Daniel knows nothing of my past, Vivian continued. He believes his father died before he was born, a convenient fiction that saved me from explaining a married man's abandonment. He doesn't know I have a sister, parents, a whole former life. She pushed the envelope toward me. When I'm gone, he'll be alone. I'd like him to know his family. You, your son, your grandchildren, his family. I made no move to take the envelope. You expect me to step in as his aunt now, after you've kept him from us his entire life? I expect nothing, she said quietly. I'm asking, Rebecca. I'm asking you to consider being there for him when I can't be. To tell him about his grandparents, about our childhood, about who his mother was before Vivian Carson ceased to exist. And who has she been since? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Who did you become after you abandoned us? Vivian Miller. I moved to Chicago, found work as a bookkeeper, raised Daniel alone, built a quiet life, a good life in many ways, but one shadowed by the knowledge of what I'd done to all of you. She met my gaze directly. I've never married, never allowed myself that happiness. It seemed wrong somehow to have a normal life after what I'd done. A waitress approached our table, but Vivian waved her away with a polite smile. Then she reached into her purse again and withdrew a small, worn photograph. This is Daniel, she said, handing it to me. Taken last year at his hospital. I looked down at the image of a dark-haired man in a white coat, with Vivian's eyes and our father's serious expression. My nephew. A person who had existed for 35 years without my knowledge. Why now? I asked, returning the photo. Why not take your secret to the grave? It would be kinder to him, wouldn't it, to not learn his mother's whole life was a lie? Perhaps, she acknowledged, but he'll have questions after I'm gone. He'll go through my papers, my effects. He's too smart not to realize I've hidden things from him. She gestured to the envelope. My contact information is in there, along with Daniel's. I'm not asking you to reach out immediately. Just consider it. Think about whether you might someday be willing to meet him. I stared at her, this stranger with my sister's eyes, my sister's voice, my sister's distinctive way of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was anxious. A sister I had mourned for 35 years, whose death had defined the trajectory of my life in ways I was only now beginning to understand. You could have reached out before, I said, my voice thick with suppressed emotion. Any time in the past 3 decades. Before Mom died still grieving for you. Before I spent half my life carrying the weight of your absence. Yes, she agreed simply. I could have. I should have. Fear kept me away at first, then shame, then the sheer impossibility of explaining my disappearance after so much time had passed. She reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching mine. I've thought of you every day, Becca, wondered where you were, what your life was like. I even attended your wedding, sat in the back of the church, left before the reception. You were so beautiful. This detail, the idea that she had been present at one of the most important days of my life, watching from the shadows, broke something inside me. Tears I'd been fighting since I first saw her spilled over, running down my cheeks unchecked. How could you? I whispered. How could you watch and not say anything? Because I'm a coward, she said, her own eyes brimming. I always have been, not like you. You were always the brave one, though you never believed it. She withdrew her hand, sensing my inability to accept her touch just yet. I don't expect forgiveness, Rebecca. I don't deserve it, but Daniel does deserve to know his family, and you deserve to know your nephew, if you want to. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of decades of separation and deception hanging between us. Finally, I reached for the envelope, placing it in my purse without opening it. I can't promise anything, I said. I need time to process all this, to decide what, if anything, I want to do with this information. Of course, she said. I understand. How much time do you really have? I asked. With the cancer. A shadow crossed her face. The doctors say 2 months at most. The treatments aren't working as well as they'd hoped. I nodded, absorbing this information. My sister, found and soon to be lost again. The universe had a cruel sense of timing. Are you in pain? I asked, a flicker of sisterly concern breaking through my shock and anger. Sometimes. They have me on good medications. She attempted a smile. I'm staying at the Harborview Inn, just down the street. Room 212. I'll be here for 1 more week before returning to Chicago. She hesitated. If you wanted to talk again, ask more questions, or just sit together quietly, I'd welcome that. But I understand if this is our only meeting. The waitress returned, more insistent this time about taking our order. We both asked for tea, more to satisfy her than from any desire for refreshment. Tell me about your life, Vivian said when the waitress had gone. You were a teacher? High school English. For 30 years. I found myself sharing the basic outline of my life. My marriage to Robert, our son David, my career, Robert's death from a stroke 6 years earlier. The words came automatically, as if I were describing someone else's existence. When our tea arrived, we sipped in awkward silence, neither knowing how to navigate this impossible reunion. The anger I felt was tempered by the knowledge of her illness, by the physical evidence of her suffering, visible in her too thin frame and the shadows beneath her eyes. You look like Mom, I said suddenly. Around the eyes. She smiled, a genuine smile that briefly illuminated her tired face. And you look like Dad, that determined expression, like you're constantly evaluating whether people are measuring up. He was never the same after you, after we thought you died. I said, none of us were. I'm sorry, Rebecca, she said again, the words painfully inadequate for the magnitude of what she had done. If I could go back. But you can't, I finished for her. None of us can. As our meeting drew to its awkward conclusion, I found myself torn between fury at her deception and a surprising, unwelcome tenderness toward this frail woman who shared my blood, my history, my earliest memories. I had spent 35 years as an only child, carrying the weight of our parents' grief alone. Now, in the space of an hour, I was a sister again, and soon would be bereaved anew, this time with the full knowledge of what I was losing. Will you tell him about me? I asked as we prepared to leave. Daniel, will you explain before? If you want me to, she said, or you can tell him yourself, in your own time, in your own way. Whatever you decide is right. Outside the café, we stood facing each other on the sunlit sidewalk. 2 elderly women, at the end of a lunch date, as far as any observer could tell. But between us lay a lifetime of separation, of choices made and unmade, of a family fractured and perhaps, just possibly, with the opportunity for partial healing. "Goodbye, Rebecca," Vivian said, and I heard in her voice the acceptance that this might be our final meeting. "Thank you for coming, for listening." "Goodbye, Vivian," I replied, her name strange on my tongue after so many years of silence. I turned and walked away, the envelope heavy in my purse. My mind already racing ahead to what I would do with this newfound knowledge. Part of me wanted to tear up the envelope, to protect myself from further pain. Another part recognized the gift being offered, a nephew, a connection to my sister, a chance to expand my family in my later years. I spent the night in Millfield, unable to face the train journey home with my thoughts so turbulent. In my hotel room, I finally opened the envelope Vivian had given me. Inside were photographs of Daniel at various ages, from infancy to adulthood, his contact information, address, phone number, email. A brief medical history, noting that our family's tendency toward high blood pressure had manifested in him as well. And a letter addressed to him, sealed, with instructions that it be given to him after Vivian's death. I didn't sleep much that night. How could I, with the past and present colliding so violently, with the future suddenly uncertain in ways I couldn't have imagined 2 days earlier? By morning, I had made my decision. I checked out of the hotel and walked to the Harborview Inn, room 212. I knocked, my heart pounding with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something like recognition. Vivian opened the door, surprise evident in her expression. She looked even frailer in the morning light. A woman holding death at bay through sheer determination. "I'd like to meet him," I said without preamble. "Daniel, before you, while you're still here to make the introduction." Relief flooded her features. "You would do that after everything?" "He's my nephew," I said simply. "And you're still my sister. That doesn't erase what you did, but it doesn't erase our connection either." I hesitated, then added the truth I had realized during the night. "I grieved you once, Vivian. I don't want to grieve you again without at least trying to know who you've become." She stepped back, inviting me into her room. It was neat, but clearly occupied by someone in declining health. Prescription bottles lined up on the dresser, a wheelchair folded in the corner, a hospital bed replacing the standard hotel furnishing. "I'll call him today," she said. "He can fly up this weekend, if you're willing to stay that long." I nodded, my gaze falling on a photograph beside her bed, Daniel in his graduation cap and gown, his arm around Vivian, both beaming with pride. My sister and her son. Family I had never known existed until yesterday. "He has your smile," I observed, "and Dad's height." "Yes," Vivian's voice was soft with maternal pride. "But he has your steadiness, your sense of responsibility. Sometimes I look at him and see you at 16, so serious, so determined to do the right thing." The right thing. Was I doing it now, opening this door to a relationship with my sister's son? Or was I setting myself up for more pain, more complications in what had been a carefully ordered life? "I can't promise what will happen after," I told her honestly. "Whether I'll maintain contact with Daniel after you're gone, this is all too new, too raw." "I understand," she said. "One day at a time. It's how I've learned to live these past few months." She gestured to the chair near the window. "Will you stay a while? I have photo albums, stories about Daniel growing up, things I'd like to share with you, if you're willing to hear them." I hesitated only briefly before sitting down. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." As the morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between us, my sister began to tell me about her life, the one she had lived in the shadows of the one she had abandoned. I listened, not yet ready to forgive, but willing, at least, to understand. And in that understanding, I found something I had thought lost forever, the tentative beginnings of sisterhood, of family, of connections renewed before they were permanently severed. Not a happy ending, perhaps, but a more truthful one than the story I had believed for 35 years. The blue envelope had delivered not just an invitation, but a choice, to remain locked in the past or to step, however cautiously, into a future that acknowledged both the wounds and the healing that families, even broken ones, can offer one another. I chose the latter, for Daniel's sake, for my own, and for the sister I had mourned and found and would soon lose again, this time with my eyes wide open to all she had been, both the girl I had loved and the woman who had hurt me beyond measure. Some ghosts, it seems, return not to haunt us, but to offer us one last chance to know them truly before they depart for good.